Right now, while most of America is focused on headlines about diplomacy and ceasefire talks, Russia is quietly doing something that deserves a far closer look, and it causes ein B ein and it has nothing to do with missiles or tanks. Russia's Ministry of Industry and Trade has confirmed that the full certification campaign for the LMS-901 Baikal is expected to be completed by the end of 2026. And just last December, UZGA, the Ural Civil Aviation Plant, achieved a landmark milestone, the maiden flight of the LMS-901 Baikal, powered entirely by a domestically developed VK-800 engine. That may sound like an aviation story, but it isn't. Not really. Here's what this actually is. It's Russia demonstrating methodically, quietly, and with remarkable patience that Western sanctions have failed at the most fundamental level. The VK-800 is already planned for use across 3 new Russian aircraft models, and compared to the previously used American engine on prototype models, the new Russian VK-800 delivers lower weight, lower fuel consumption, and higher generated power. Think about what that means. A country under the most sweeping aviation sanctions in modern history just flew a domestically engineered aircraft with a domestically built engine toward full domestic certification. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, Western sanctions caused Russian aircraft production to grind to a near halt almost overnight. That was the plan, economic strangulation. And yet here we are. Now, is this an Aerospace from your IBC over in Normandy? Is this a direct military threat to Ukraine? That's exactly the question we need to unpack. Because sometimes the most dangerous power isn't the one pointing a weapon. Sometimes it's the one that no longer needs yours. So let's slow down and actually think about what's happening here, because the framing matters enormously. Every time Russia announces a milestone in its domestic aviation program, the Western press either ignores it entirely or dismisses it as propaganda. And I understand the temptation to do that, because on its face, a small 9-seat utility aircraft doesn't sound like geopolitics. It sounds like a rural transport story. But here's the thing, Hantenskau, C and A N O O Winistauer, where he's in A. Context is everything in geopolitics, and the context surrounding the LMS-901 Baikal is anything but ordinary. Let's go back to the beginning, because you need to understand what Russia was trying to do with this aircraft and why it matters. The Russian Ministry of Industry and Trade selected UZJ, the Tewasid Anoro that and the Ural Works of Civil Aviation by Dista Yuri Times back in October 2019 to develop a replacement for the widespread Antonov An-2, an old Soviet workhorse that has been the backbone of light aviation in Russia's remote regions for decades. That's important. This aircraft was designed specifically to connect the parts of Russia that roads, railways, and larger aircraft simply cannot reach. And when you understand the sheer geography of Russia, a country in Burstin in Dershutis, a country that spans 11 time zones, eyes inside always you start to realize that light aviation isn't a luxury for Moscow. It's a strategic necessity. Without air travel, roughly 60% of Russia's territory a year is areas not reachable by road or rail for Basemak in a state or race is effectively cut off from the rest of the country. Think about that number, 60%. That's not a transportation inconvenience. That's a fundamental vulnerability in national cohesion, economic integration, and military logistics. So when the West imposed crushing sanctions on Russia following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, one of the things those sanctions targeted, largely by severing Russia from Boeing, Airbus, and their component supply chains, was precisely this vulnerability. Almost all Russian commercial aircraft use an extensive amount of Western parts, and Russian aircraft production ground to a halt seemingly overnight as a result of the sanctions. The theory was clean, logical, and brutal in its ambition. If you can't fly, you can't govern, you can't supply, you can't sustain a war economy across a country that vast. It was a form of strategic strangulation. And for a while, it seemed like it was working. Now, here's where I want you to really pay attention, because this is where the narrative shifts. When a caster, indie and where Western analysts started to quietly revise their expectations. The immediate impact of sanctions was less severe than expected, creating a sense of euphoria within the Russian government and among many economic stakeholders. However, the medium-term consequences began intensifying, while the unrealistic nature of certain import substitution plans became increasingly apparent. So Russia adapted. They cannibalized aircraft for parts. They extended component lifespans beyond recommended limits. They smuggled components through shadow networks. A recent deal between Volga-Dnieper and Aeroflot involved transferring 8 cargo aircraft purely for parts harvesting. One Yimure Pris Ananis a practice that reveals just how desperate the situation became. And yet, the machine kept running. Imperfectly, dangerously, but running. What Russia did at the same time was something that history will probably remember more than the short-term improvisation. They launched one of the most ambitious domestic aviation reconstruction programs in the modern era. In summer of 2022, Russia started, at least on paper, a manufacturing plan whereby by 2030, the idea was to manufacture 1,036 completely Russian-designed and completely Russian-manufactured aircraft, primarily to replace the narrow-body jets that Russian airlines had grown dependent upon through Airbuses and Boeings. Critics called it a Soviet fantasy. Some of those critics were right to be skeptical because the delays came fast and they came hard. The Superjet, the MC-21, the Tu-214, all of these programs hit walls. Certification for the SSJ-NU suffered repeated delays, and one aviation industry source told the BBC he would not bet much on production starting soon, suggesting that mass production is closer to 2030 than to 2026 or 2027. But here is what the critics missed, and insa and ma is bat im omar selm in dapur seuli and dapur. And this is the point that most Western commentators still refuse to fully engage with. Russia wasn't just trying to build airplanes. Russia was trying to rebuild an entire industrial ecosystem. And within that broader effort, the LMS-901 Baikal began to emerge as something genuinely significant, not because it's a masterpiece of engineering, but because of what its progress represents as a proof of concept. Yuzge is not only actively developing the VK800 power plant, but is also working on 3 of its modifications simultaneously: the VK800SM, VK800S1, and VK800SP, planned for use on 3 new Russian aircraft models: the LMS-901 Baikal, the twin-engine LMS-192 Ozvy, and the Russian training aircraft UTS-800. 1 engine family, 3 aircraft. That's not improvisation. That's industrial strategy. And the engine story is really the heart of the matter here, because this is where Russia was most exposed. When Western sanctions arrived, the Baikal was flying with a General Electric H80-200 engine, so ditiu a Frisari an American engine, owned by American IP, subject to American export controls, gone overnight. So Russia had to do something that nobody in the post-Soviet era had successfully done at scale. Build a competitive turboprop engine from scratch domestically under wartime resource constraints. Compared to the previously used American engine on prototype models of the Baikal, the new Russian VK800 has advantages. The weight of the Russian engine and its specific fuel consumption are lower, while the generated power is higher. These characteristics have been confirmed in a thermobaric chamber and on test benches. Now, that's a remarkable claim, and I want to be careful here because Russian state announcements deserve scrutiny. But this isn't just a press release. These are engineering verification results, and independent aviation analysts have tracked the testing timeline and confirmed the broad trajectory of progress. On February 22, 2026, the 3rd experimental flight model of the LMS-901 Baikal made its maiden flight at the Yekaterinburg airfield, the first prototype equipped with the Russian VK800SM engine and featuring design modifications including a modified cockpit, nose, more robust main landing gear, and a modified wing angle to prevent premature runway liftoff during takeoff in gusty winds. This is not a ceremonial flight. This is an active engineering refinement process. They identified problems in earlier testing. You see, easy in C specific aerodynamic behavior during gusty conditions. So and they corrected it. That's how real aviation programs work. And in January 2026, Uzga received an order for the first 100 LMS-901 Baikal aircraft, with leasing deliveries backed by state support. 100 aircraft on order, that's an industrial commitment, not a prototype showcase. Now, let's bring in the tension, because there is genuine tension in this story, and it would be dishonest of me to pretend otherwise. The Baikal program has been plagued by delays since its very inception. The aircraft has been continuously delaying certification since 2023, first to 2025, then to 2026, and now hints point to 2027, with technical and financial issues making it impossible to set a firm date. That's a real problem. And in May 2025, this program nearly died publicly. At least rhetorically. Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Trutnev announced that the LMS-901 would no longer be produced due to an unclear impasse, though First Deputy Prime Minister Denis Manturov denied the claim shortly after, stating that all final decisions had been made and and the project would continue. That kind of internal contradiction at the highest levels of Russian government tells you something important. This program is politically contested. There are factions within the Russian state that have lost patience with the delays and the cost overruns. There are others who understand that killing it would be strategically catastrophic, and so far the latter have won the argument. The full certification campaign for the LMS-901 Baikal is now expected to be completed by end of 2026, with a permissible schedule slip of approximately 1 to 1.5 months, according to Russia's Ministry of Industry and Trade. Whether that timeline holds is genuinely uncertain. Even Russia's own civil aviation regulator, Rosaviatsia, did not mention the LMS-901 in its plans for 2026. A detail that should not be overlooked. But what is not uncertain is the direction of travel. The program is advancing. The engine has flown. The third prototype is in the air. The ground vibration and frequency testing that is currently underway is a standard but critical step. It validates the structural dynamics of the airframe and clears the way for expanding the certified flight envelope. This is not theater. This is engineering. So now we get to the question that's in the title of this video, and it's a question I want you to sit with for a moment rather than answer too quickly. Is the Baikal a threat to Ukraine? The obvious answer, and the one most military analysts would give you, is no. It's a 9-seat turboprop utility aircraft. It doesn't carry weapons. It has no targeting systems. It isn't designed for anything resembling a combat role. So in the narrow tactical military sense, no. The Baikal is not going to appear over the battlefields of eastern Ukraine. That's not the point. The point is something deeper and more difficult to see clearly, which is why so few people are talking about it. Russia's war economy is under mounting strain, with manufacturing declining and growth slowing to just 0.6% in 2025. And yet within that strained war economy, Russia is simultaneously running multiple domestic industrial programs, aviation, engines, electronics, drones, satellites, all aimed at the same strategic goal, severing dependence on the West entirely. In late December 2025, United Aircraft Corporation confirmed that a domestically produced suite of avionics and components for the Tu-214, including advanced safety systems, received certification approval, with the Russian Minister of Industry and Trade noting that the approval would pave the way for these domestically produced systems to be installed on other aircraft models. That's the pattern. One certification opens the door for the next. One proven component becomes the foundation for the broader fleet. What this means for Ukraine, and I want to be very direct about this, is is not that Russia is developing a new weapon. It's that Russia is slowly, imperfectly, and at enormous cost building the industrial and logistical backbone that would allow it to sustain a prolonged conflict without Western supply chains, without Western goodwill, and without Western leverage. Russia currently occupies approximately 20% of Ukrainian territory, having expanded its control by more than 4,000 square kilometers in 2024, and the conflict continues across multiple fronts, with Russia maintaining pressure through ground operations and aerial strikes. That's the military reality on the ground. And what sustains that military reality, all say what keeps Russian forces supplied across a front line that stretches hundreds of miles through some of the most logistically challenging terrain in Europe, is a domestic industrial capacity that the West assumed sanctions would destroy. They didn't destroy it. They damaged it. They slowed it. They forced painful and expensive substitutions. Internal documents from Russian state institutions reveal that 319 technical failures were recorded over just 3 months in late 2025, with 55 of those occurring during flight, and the primary cause is critical dependence on imported aviation systems that, after sanctions, can no longer be replaced or repaired. So the pressure is real and the pain is real, but the response is also real. Russia is not standing still. It is restructuring, substituting, and rebuilding. And the Baikal is one small but telling piece of that larger picture. So, you have to understand what this aircraft symbolizes beyond its payload capacity and its passenger count. Once certified, the LMS-901 Baikal is expected to transform regional air transport by accessing remote airfields, operating reliably in challenging weather, providing consistent service to remote communities, replacing the aging An-2 fleet, and enabling new possibilities for air ambulance services, geological exploration, cargo delivery, and tourist transport. That's the civilian framing. But read that list again through a strategic lens. Remote airfields, reliable operation in challenging weather, cargo delivery, delivery, the ability to reach areas that no road or railway connects. In a country the size of Russia, fighting a war that depends on supply lines across vast distances, these are not incidental capabilities. They are military logistics capabilities wearing a civilian label. The Soviet past tells us that even though Russia won't be able to manufacture airplanes according to their original schedule or to the quality standards of Boeing and Airbus in terms of range and efficiency, if they stick to this plan, they will be able to establish some infrastructure, some funding, some foundation for something that will produce completely Russian-built aircraft by the 2030s. That's from a Wilson Center scholar, not from Russian state media, and that assessment deserves serious weight because history is full of examples of countries that shouldn't have been able to build what they built under conditions that seemed to preclude it, and yet they did. The question is not whether Russia's aviation programs are on schedule. So and EU is sorry, most of them aren't. The question is whether they are directionally real, and the evidence increasingly suggests that they are. So what does this all mean for the broader geopolitical picture that you and I are trying to understand together? It means that the West's strategy of using economic coercion, specifically aviation sanctions, to break Russia's strategic capacity has produced a paradoxical result. It damaged Russia's commercial aviation sector significantly. It caused real hardship and real safety risks for Russian civilians, but it also forced Russia to do something it would never have done voluntarily in peacetime: build a genuinely sovereign industrial base in aviation. The very pressure that was supposed to bring Russia to its knees has become the forcing function for Russian industrial self-reliance. Russia's aviation sector will grow more reliant on the state, which will make it less efficient, less innovative, and more expensive. So, but the Iranian experience shows what prolonged sanctions ultimately produce: an industry shut out of global markets, but grimly functional for domestic and military purposes. And that's the real threat. Not a Baikal carrying troops, not a Baikal dropping bombs, but a Russia that slowly, and they slowly, expensively, imperfectly, learns to need nothing from the West. Because a Russia that needs nothing from the West cannot be leveraged by the West. And a Russia that cannot be economically leveraged is a Russia whose behavior can only be influenced through direct confrontation. That is a far more dangerous world than the one we were living in before this war began. The Baikal LMS-901 is not a weapon, but what it represents, the grinding, stubborn, costly march toward industrial sovereignty under the most severe peacetime pressure in modern history, that is a strategic development every American thinking seriously about global power should be watching very closely. Because the lesson of history is consistent, nations under genuine existential pressure tend to find resources and capabilities that comfortable nations assume don't exist. Russia is under that pressure, and the Baikal certification process is one small concrete signal that the response to that pressure is not collapse. It's its adaptation.